Hello and welcome to the Patreon page of True Crime Rocket Science. In today's episode we'll be reviewing the FBI's riskiest move, and I guess it was also the CBI's riskiest move, in the interrogation of Chris Watts. First of all, thank you to the many new patrons on Patreon, about 115 I think at last count. I want to apologize to a couple of you who were, I think it's been a day or two that I haven't posted any content on Patreon. The reason for that is I've just finished Murder Most Foul, so that was really the deadline that I was just honoring in that respect. I've also posted a couple of videos on YouTube, but I wanted to sort of set aside special time and proper concentration for Patreon, just because I think one needs to put in a bit more of an effort and concentrate on the work on this channel. So that's the reason for it. There's also been kind of a build-up of various narratives and information, especially from criminal confessions, and so I'm pleased to be able to go into this particular subject, the FBI's riskiest move, with a little bit more background, because at the time that I wanted to do it, I really had very little material to work with, and fortunately a little bit more has come to light just in the last couple of minutes really. So I do want to recommend that you guys go to the video I've just posted prior to this one. It's 10 minutes long. It's got some interesting background. If there's anything you guys would like me to delve into there, I certainly can. I have put up a blog post on Crime Rocket, where I intend to just delve at some stage into the actual reason why Chris Watts got so frustrated when this idea of the emotional conversation came up. As I mentioned on Twitter, as a result of just quite a few different conversations that are going on, I've decided to spend a lot more time than I actually intended to on matters of criminal psychology. I see there's a review posted of a recent book that's out on Chris Watts, published I think today, where I think he's described as either as a hidden psychopath or a covert signs of a hidden psychopath, whatever that is. So I really just want to address everything that is going to flow out of that, but really sticking to the narcissistic aspects. And of course in Derhali's book she does refer to the various subtypes of narcissism. Let's become experts on the various subtypes of narcissism, and so we're not going to look at her book at this point, but I certainly want to just address the narcissism aspect from a true crime perspective. Now, what you might find interesting just looking at the images that I put up is you are seeing two faces of Chris Watts. You're seeing kind of a human face, on the right hand side, and then you're seeing something that's more machine-like, more mechanical, more monstrous on the left hand side. But without needing to be a genius or a psychologist, what you're seeing are two faces. And even Derhali in her description refers to Watts's double life and the duplicity regarding his affair. And I think a mistake that is being made by so many people is we're trying to find rocket science when it's pretty clear kind of what's going on. It's someone who's a two-face, someone who's a hypocrite, someone who has one face to the world and another face to somebody else. I don't know why one's got to find a disorder or sophisticated psychological concepts to explain that. It's simply leading a double life, and we see so often how that leads to crime. Leading a double life leads to leading a life of lies. And while that's simplistic to say, I think one can just expand on that also in a relatively simple way, and that's what I'm going to be doing over the next couple of episodes. So I'm going to be doing a series of 4 episodes on the YouTube channel on narcissism specifically, and then I'll be doing a kind of a follow-up, an extension effectively to that, a supplement on this channel dealing with the dark triad and dealing with deeper aspects, including lessons from comic book psychology. Some people may find this off-putting, especially because I think it's a guy's zone. Guys seem to like comic books quite a lot, but one thing about comic books is they're very good at sketching the identities and the personalities and the sort of character arcs of their characters, whether it's villains or heroes. And comic books are very good at making that very, very clear with colors, with facial expressions, with character traits, and we're just going to look at how that informs the Watts case, especially through the comic book character of Two-Face. And what's interesting with Two-Face is he literally transfers responsibility in terms of his own life to a coin. In other words, to the symbol of money. And so when he flicks this coin, the one side of the coin is sort of scarred and damaged, and the other side is sort of clean and the face is undamaged, and whatever side that lands on determines what his action is going to be, whether it's going to be good or evil, whether it's going to be one way or the other. In other words, it's totally random. And it's probably just important to bear this in mind, this two-faced character and the flip of the coin, when we think about not only the interrogators in the cubicle at the time that they were interrogating Chris Watts, but also Chris Watts himself. I think quite a lot of coin flipping was going on in the minds of the 3 people in the room. Should I answer this question? Should I be honest? And then also, should we ask Chris this question? Are we pushing him too hard? Should we push the trickery? Should we manipulate him more? Should we be more authentic with him or less authentic, and all that kind of thing? But I think one aspect that I think is very compelling and certainly fascinating for me is what I call the psychology of separation. And it is taking what I think is quite a silly notion, which is a lot of people wondering, why did Chris Watts separate the children into 2 tanks? And they sort of wonder what sort of intricate psychologies that work there. While I'm a little bit dismissive of that aspect, I think there is a very interesting broader aspect in terms of the psychology of separation, just in terms of the story of Chris Watts, how he is, and we're going to go through it now, how he is separated from his father during the interrogation, how he's separated from everybody else, how he is separated when his wife is somewhere else, how he's being expected to go through separation but he's not quite sure how. The whole separation that is involved where one premeditates, the whole separation of sentencing and spending a life sentence separated from the world. So that whole psychology of separation, I think, is quite has some interesting lessons and applications just in a broader sense. Interestingly, there was an article, I think, in the Antipodean press, which I think is like New Zealand and Australia, just referring to the 4 words that kind of changed everything, that elicited the confession. And I think I think those 4 words were did Shanann do something? In any event, we're about 10 minutes into this episode. I want to get cracking with the kind of nuts and bolts of it. And what I want to share with you is just the true crime rocket science version of the interrogation, why it was so effective, what was sort of going on in the minds of the agents, and what the process was, the sort of step-by-step process that broke Watts down and got behind that face, that first face, that first barrier of the machine to the whatever was behind it. And the first trick, if you want to use that word, the first ploy that the agents had at their disposal was time. They had a lot of time, because they're free. Law enforcement, the difference between law enforcement and a suspect is law enforcement are free. They can come and go, they can move, they have freedom of movement, they have freedom of association. A suspect loses that advantage. A suspect has the advantage of time and the insights of time into his own action, certainly into his own backstory, and being able to cover that up, and the advantage that they don't know anything about him, they don't know anything about his situation. But the tables quickly turn where they then kind of gain time on him, and they're able to strip everything else away. When he has meals, who else he talks to, and just in terms of his conversations with Coda and Lee, Watts may not have realized it, but he's the fact that there are 2 brains second guessing him, challenging him, questioning him, interrogating him, means he's hopelessly outclassed. Even if there was one and that person steps out the room, they are getting all the information from a team of people that are studying everything that's being said, that are opening files, that are collecting information. This is the FBI and the CBI. And so even if it was one person, he's hopelessly outgunned. When you've got 2, in the confines of that cubicle, you have the one who is applying his experience and insight and asking questions in a apparently innocent way. But like Tammy Lee says in the clip that I posted just a few minutes ago, what they were doing is asking the same question over and over and over again, and then coming at it each time in a different way. And what they will then do is study the transcript, just as I have, just as I as a narrator have studied it and said, wow, it's interesting to see at this point he uses these words, and at this point he's changed slightly what he said here, so that part can't be true. And so through a process of elimination and cross-referencing, you start to get a more cogent version that he, how can I put it, he unwittingly provides. He's obviously trying to not tell them what is, but the subconscious just has a way of, the subconscious knows the truth, and even when the conscious tries to hold it back, it invariably slips out. So with time, they have had a big advantage, and if you actually add up all the time, it was not just what's having a lack of sleep, going back quite a while, but also just in terms of the interrogation time, he came into that, I think, quite tired, quite drained. A lot of people asking him questions, him, thinking a mile a minute for how long, and then he comes into this situation, and it started off around about 4 hours from 1900 to 2300 on the Tuesday, and then the next day was essentially from 11 o'clock, and then the interview sort of ended with his arrest, and I mean that was around about midnight. He wasn't interrogated from 11 in the morning until midnight, but for a substantial period between that. I mean, I think it went on easily till around 8 o'clock. So it was, 7-8 hours. If you add the days, the hours before, it's around about 12 hours of constant questioning by 2 people who are hitting you over and over and over again, with these questions. And what he doesn't maybe realize while he's, responding to these questions, he's separated from his world. He's in an alien, hostile environment, and if he fails this test, he loses his life. It's almost like he's being murdered himself. If he doesn't play his cards right, then he is being systematically murdered. Just as in, his life will be flushed down the drain. And so the stakes are really, really high. And the longer it takes him to, lawyer up or to realize the situation he's in, the better that it is for the interrogators. And kudos to them that they managed to keep him talking for as long as they did. It just shows they are both of them were very skilled at what they were doing. As much as they were skilled, Watts was also a pretty tough nut to crack. Bear in mind, after all these hours, I think it was around about 4 o'clock that the lie detector test, the polygraph, ended, and then both agents entered the room. And at that stage, they didn't even know that he'd had an affair. This is around about 9 hours into their questioning. It's quite a long time. And the only reason they knew he was lying was because Kissinger had spoken to the feds. And so that was the first crack that they established. And they established that crack not because Watts cracked, but because Kissinger gave them that in. And that obviously was that had to be quite shocking for Chris Watts. He may have suspected that she'd said something. He may have even just in the fact that they knew, he may have felt, okay, the game's up. And it wasn't necessarily. I'm just saying that was a huge blow to his efforts at rebuffing the questioning. So that was the first major crack in that facade, and then after that the facade came crumbling down quite quickly. So 9 hours is quite a long time, but then after that it was fairly quick. If they managed to get this crack, they weren't really able to get much beyond that. So after the crack with the affair, they started vilifying Shanann a little bit, trying to get onto his side, and they succeeded in that, but they hadn't gotten anything for their efforts. And so what they started to do was dangle a psychological carrot, and what that carrot was effectively, at one point Watts said, can I please speak to my dad? And you can actually hear he's quite choked up. He's actually quite tearful. He actually sounds pretty emotional when he says that. And so what's quite clever with the agents is they dangle the psychological carrot of, okay, we're going to let you talk to your father. But then they don't. They continue talking to him for another, whatever it was, 10, 20 minutes. So what he's thinking is, I won something, I want to talk to my dad, but they want something. So if you just tell me this and that, then once we're happy, we'll leave, and then you can talk to your dad. So there's this psychological carrot that's being dangled. Cooperate, answer these questions, and then I will do that. And so that was very much in operation. Again, with no actual statements, that they could do anything with, but what they didn't know this, but what they had succeeded in doing was getting into Watts's head, with this whole idea of, talk to your dad about this, if you're not going to talk to us, talk to your dad. And it's actually incredible that these complete strangers would suggest this to him, and then he would actually do it. But if you think about it, Watts was exactly that kind of person. Shanann was always telling him what to do, so he was used to taking orders. Even if the orders were orders he didn't want to follow, he was used to doing it. And I think he was so broken down that maybe it was just a relief, or just almost like a default setting that he would do as he was told. The same sort of thing can be used in terms of food or a break or something like that, to say, okay, we're going to let you go, but we're going to let you go, whatever, and then they ask another half an hour of questions. And so what the person is thinking is, oh, the interview's over, the tension's over, I'm going to, so now I can sort of relax. And that's often when the best material comes. And if you think about it, at the very end of the interview, that's where Chris Watts actually reveals the locations of the bodies, the most critical information. Again, he didn't need to do that, but it was sort of like, well, we're going to bring you some food, So there are a lot of tricks that are employed by the interrogators. And the prime one here, and as I say, it was a risky one from their perspective, and also from other perspectives. Ultimately it paid off for them, so it was actually a very risky setup from Ronnie Watts' perspective, and it was a risky setup from Watts' perspective, but it could really have gone either way. And by setup, what I mean is, I don't know how many people are aware of this. It is in the discovery, but what happened was, for quite a long time before Chris Watts spoke to his father, the agents kind of said to him, they continued asking him questions, and then they would sort of tie the question to his father and say, he's come here a long way, he also wants to know what happened. I think you owe it to him to tell him, right? So that was how they were setting Watts up, so that when they walked out the room, it wasn't just, okay, the pressure's off. In that way, they'd sort of shaped his thinking, they'd shaped his psychology, they'd shaped the conversation without even being in the room. And again, a stronger personality, a more kind of extroverted kind of person, someone who's not a people pleaser, that could have been water for ducks back. But in Watts' case, it wasn't like that. It was almost like, we will let you speak to your dad, but we really need you to keep talking about this thing. And so that's exactly what he did, which is incredible and also crazy, but it worked. The part that I'm not sure if everyone's aware of that is fascinating is, again, Chris Watts is stuck in that room. He doesn't know what's going on beyond that room, and that's why it's just in terms of his rights and whatever you want to call it, his side of the equation. Obviously, we don't care about it. It's good that he's in jail, but just playing devil's advocate, Chris Watts doesn't know what's going on outside, and what was going on outside was the agents went and spoke to Ronnie, and so they did exactly the same thing with him. They set him up and said, listen here, we really need to question Watts, but if you can talk to him, we'll give you guys a little bit of time together. He really wants to talk to you, but he really wants to talk to you about what happened. He trusts you, you his hero, and would you mind just going in there and listening? But please also just make sure that you talk about the case. We're running out of time. And so they could have made a really cogent argument for why father and son needed to talk about one subject and one subject only. But again, the crazy part is that the father and son both did exactly as they were told. And you've got to, I think, bear in mind that in a sense, the Wattses are kind of simple people. They are blue-collar workers. They're used to being sort of put in a box and told to do X, Y, and Z. They're used to kind of, how can I put it, very structured work and very structured roles, right? And so by giving them these roles to play, some people simply just wouldn't have played out. It wouldn't have worked. But in these individuals' cases, it amazingly did. And so you can go and listen to the clip and just pick up the little bit of audio where Coda says to Watts, this is just after Watts has sort of made quite a plaintive appeal, like almost in tears, can I please speak to my dad? And Coda says, if you brought your dad in here, would you please tell him what happened? And he's asking him, he's saying, would you? Not, you must, we'll only do it, is asking. And it's a very simple, clever question, but I mean, how on earth do you say no to that? Why wouldn't you say to your father what happened? Well, if you committed the crime, of course. But Watts is so broken down by this point that he doesn't recognize this piece of the puzzle, and he has been psychologically pushed to pretty much to breaking point, which is why he's quite tearful. He hasn't cracked yet, but he's very close. And so the amazing thing is that they actually use emotions. They've also used the angle of vilifying Shanann, because that's exactly what he does when he talks to his father. I mean, the first thing he says is, I don't want to protect her. And his father's, what did he say? You don't want to protect her. And then what says, I hurt her. And then it becomes, I killed her. His father in the beginning doesn't hear what he said. But it's not the case that his father steps into the room and he says, we need to do this, or he steps into the room with the idea of shit's gone down, I need to listen. And Watts says the same thing of, okay, my father's here, and suddenly I think he feels the emotion. He feels there's a sense of relief that his father's he's got a friendly face to talk to, and then he literally falls into the trap of doing what he wants to do, because he does want to tell his father. He does want to get himself off the hook, but it's the worst possible thing he could do in terms of his own situation, to aggravate the situation. But that just shows how cleverly the situation was manufactured by the agents. In a weird way, they've remote controlled both these individuals by kind of controlling their psychological narratives. And I think it's important to just to say that, if they can do this with these suspects under this kind of duress, why couldn't or wouldn't they be able to sort of control the public narrative in certain ways, whether it's to do with Nicole Kessinger or if it's to do with important interests in the oil industry. It's all about manipulating psychologically intelligence and information. And these people are supposed to be the best in the business. So are you telling me that they're not doing that, or can't do that, or haven't been doing that? I put up a blog post on Crime Rocket some time ago about the effectiveness of the good cop, bad cop routine. In this sense, the good cop was basically Ronnie Watts. I mean, in the end, Ronnie got the confession, and he was kind of the good cop. The bad cops were, Coda and Lee, who drained Watts of his resistance and, just broke him down. And so when they left the room and the good cop entered, it was sort of over. And so, I mean, even that psychology worked quite well. If you think about the whole good cop, bad cop thing, it kind of reflects this whole idea of someone who has two faces as well, and then one must also think just about the risk-reward scenario here. I think it's definitely a valid point to say they were taking a big risk. The investigators could have sort of, I wouldn't say lost the case here, but they could have lost a lot. They could have lost the element of, I wouldn't say surprise, but that they would have lost momentum, put it that way. They could have lost momentum. It could have just all come to a grinding halt after Ronnie had spoken to them. But there was also the potential reward. The alternative was they had spoken to Watts for hours and hours and hours and basically got nothing out of him. And so by the time Ronnie was sent in, it was almost like the last straw for them as well. I mean, as good a job as they had done in breaking him down, they hadn't actually gotten anything out of him. He was broken down, but he hadn't let anything out, right? And so they thought, we're backing ourselves, we're going to take this risk, and there's potentially going to be a reward here. And a huge disclosure made, I think, during the polygraph. I mean, that whole extended version of the polygraph, which again Watts was totally duped into revealing so much. I mean, a polygraph doesn't need to be hours and hours and hours in length. It can be a lot shorter. But in any event, during the polygraph, Watts let slip that his father is not only his hero but his best friend. And so this whole idea of relief, it's not just a friendly face that he's going to see next. It's the friendliest face that he has in the whole world. Given what he's just done, this is probably the person he most desperately wants to see and be with and be comforted by. And so you can imagine, after hours of awkwardness, hours of anxiety, hours of psychological pushing and pressuring, when his father walks in and doesn't really even say anything. And I mean, that to me stood out when I was researching my books, was the power of Ronnie Watts. I mean, the skill in his, if you want to compare the effectiveness of the interrogators to the magic of Ronnie Watts, the main difference was Ronnie virtually didn't say anything. He spoke very little. He spoke in very short sentences. He often would repeat a word that Watts had said, which is also a pretty good technique, which I think he was just using by happenstance. But it was also his quietness meant that Watts could kind of be himself, and meant that Watts could now speak, and Watts could also think. But to hammer him with questions meant you were pushing him back into himself, making him think, making him protective, making him basically anxious. And so in the situation where two people had left the room, and bear in mind Watts is an introvert, he now is in a safer space and is with his father. And so in this space he's soothed enough to talk to his father. And I don't think it was quite the confession that people have built it up to be. Watts whispered it. You couldn't hear a lot of what was saying. I don't know if it would have been admissible in court, possibly. But the fact that Watts then went further after that confession spoke volumes. All I'm saying is the confession itself to his father, I don't know if it would have sufficed, but they nevertheless made the big breakthrough in this moment. And that was the reward. Watts got the reward. Watts got the moment of intimacy with his dad. He also got his dad to sort of back him in the Shanann did it yarn. I mean, his father quickly got onto the bandwagon, saying, look at this photo that she took of Bella with a doll. And that was my number one what the F moment on YouTube. Just as the speed at which his father sort of backed him. And so you can also see why Watts needed his father, and why his father kind of, in a way, came to his rescue. And after that, try to do more. He said, we need to get you a lawyer. And literally within about 7, 8, 9, 10 seconds of saying that, literally as soon as he said that, the agents busted into the door, and they got the interview, which was about to be derailed, was about to come to a grinding halt. They got it moving again. And again, this was an opportunity for Watts to be a man and stand up for himself and think for himself. But he had the agent rubbing his shoulders, and that's another interesting thing, is she said she didn't really want to. She didn't want to touch him. And one can imagine that she felt repulsed and she felt uncomfortable. But by doing that, I think Watts felt acknowledged, and I think he felt, I wouldn't say comfortable, but certainly more comfortable than he otherwise would. And the most important thing was that through doing this, Tammy Lee broke the connection what had formed with his dad, and she kind of came right into his space and then got him, back onto their track. And that was also done quite cleverly, and it was quite a slick movement. So it was a risk for both sides, and both sides got their reward. The agents got the reward of a breakthrough, but they now needed to follow through on it. Chris Watts got the much smaller and less significant reward of talking to his dad. But what was he talking to his dad about? Well, exactly what law enforcement wanted. Maybe Watts got a little bit of relief from the bombardment he'd gotten, but if you had to weigh them up against each other, what the law enforcement got and what Chris Watts gave up, I mean, you can't really compare it. But I think there was a sort of sense of reward on both sides, but let's face it, the reward Watts got for saying what he did was life in prison without parole. And so this was the riskiest move by the FBI, but it wasn't just a move on its own. As you can see, it was something that had evolved, and they did sort of try to hedge themselves by convincing Watts to continue talking about the whole thing with his dad and doing the same thing to his father. So it wasn't as if they just got out the room and prayed and hoped. They were quite clever in, as I say, remote controlling the interview without even being there. And there seems to be something in Watts' temperament, in his personality. After that he continued talking for hours. His father had mentioned a lawyer, the thought was there, and he didn't seize it, and he carried on talking. And he talked and he talked, and he continued volunteering information. And this tells us quite a lot about Watts' personality. It's not that he's a talkative person, it's that he feels such a strong need to be accepted. I think this is very idiosyncratic to him as a man, him as a person, and in a way it's also why I think he committed the crime. Is he felt very, very, very strongly that he wanted to be accepted by Nicole Kessinger, and his idea of being acceptable to her was that his family were out of the picture, and so in a way he was doing her bidding. That's what a lot of people don't understand. They think, I mean, I'm not saying there's any justification for him doing something, but because he thinks it's what someone else wants, so that means he's not to blame. Still the same sick psychology, but it's just very interesting, this idea that he's doing what he's doing because he thinks it's what somebody else wants. And this is an aspect that I'm not sure if even the FBI or CBI understand about him, is that when he has said certain things, it's not necessarily true, and it's not necessarily a lie. It's more likely a lie, but why is it a lie and how is it a lie? Well, it's because it's what he thinks they want to hear. And so if you follow the timber, especially of the second confession, in terms of the girls at the well site, they lay the breadcrumbs and Watts picks them up. He's not giving them a version. He is kind of following the version that is almost being given to him. And there's a big difference between that. And that's why there is a little bit of volunteering and original, unique content in the letters to Christopher, which is why it's interesting it's not even mentioned. What would really be a confession would be if he wrote down from beginning to end everything that he did and was said, but I don't think he would. Having said that, will there be a third interrogation? Could there be a fourth confession? I wouldn't hold my breath, but on the other hand, Watts isn't going anywhere, so he may not want to say anything for another year or another 5 years, or another decade, or another 2, 3, 4, 5 decades. That's a very long time to keep a secret, and maybe he will, but based on his past performance, he's spoken a lot more than we expected. He's given up a lot more than we've expected. Not just nonsense, but also some interesting details. For example, on the oxycodone. What I didn't expect was, for example, when there was this brouhaha about the oxy, and I realized, at that time, the Watts family were seriously upset by what he'd said, because I think they felt implicated. They felt that when he went to see them, what if he'd gotten something from them, and that's what everyone was speculating about, and it was just very unfair to them, and it was very dangerous and a very horrible situation to be put into. And they, I think, twisted his arm to say, look, can you set the record straight? And he kind of immediately did. He immediately said it was me. He said he got it from the basement. The joke is that nobody, that hasn't really been accepted from him. He recorded it on audio to send to me, and people just have dismissed that as either manufactured or fake, or it wasn't him, or I don't know what. But that's just yet another example of what's saying something like, I will take that to my grave, and then like the next day or shortly after that, he literally provides all the information that someone has demanded from him, because he feels like that's the right thing to do. So who knows, after enough time, if someone can convince him that it's the right thing to do to fully confess, there might be a fourth confession. I doubt whether it'll be the full and final truth. I doubt that there will ever be, but there may well be a couple of chapters to follow from where we are now. It's very early. It's barely 1 year after the crime, and there's been an incredible amount of interest, and we've seen how the John Benet Ramsey cases had legs for more than 20 years. The Madeleine McCann cases had legs for more than 12 years. And so I wouldn't be surprised if Watts' story continues to evolve and we continue to hear from him. Bear in mind that the psychology of separation is still at work. You have Watts, who is in prison. He's separated from the world. The world wants to know. And that's kind of his link with the world. The world is interested in him kind of for the first time, he may feel. Maybe for the wrong reasons, but it's still maybe a good feeling that people know his name and are interested in what he's thinking and are hanging on his every word, right? It's quite flattering. But then there's also the psychology of separation, where he's inside his cell, he knows the truth, and he wants to be able to live with himself. He doesn't want to be a two-face. He doesn't want to be a hypocrite. He wants to be as congruent as he can be. He wants to, but he can't. And yet he also might just do a few little things here and there to soothe himself into the impression that he is one person, that he is a congruent person, that he is honest, that this is what people want to hear, and that this is what did happen. I've just seen a fantastic comment on the blog about the emotional conversation that made Chris Watts feel awkward. To be honest, I feel I'm in a 100% agreement about that comment, so go and check it out. Bear in mind, we're going to be spending quite a bit of time over the next week or so talking about psychology, talking about things like narcissism and dark triads and so on. But we're also going to just try to make it very simple and just be sure that we're on the same page and that we understand what it is we're talking about. I didn't call my book, my series of books, Two-Faced for nothing. And I still think that is probably the best explanation for Chris Watts' psychology. That is kind of got a split version of himself, one that is secret and darker, not necessarily not sensitive, but just another side to himself, and then another side which he presents to the world, which is the mask that he presents to the world. In that sense, he's not very different to the rest of us. How he is different is in the effort that he goes to put a mask up. Some of us put up a little bit of a mask. Some of us go to a lot of effort. We dress up as Batman. We dress up our social media profiles with a lot of fluff, and others are more comfortable with who they are. Chris was very uncomfortable with who he is, and that's probably why he committed the crime, was because he was uncomfortable with his lot in life. He was uncomfortable with who he was, where he was, and he wanted to be the new man that Kissinger was allowing him to be. He wanted this new life that was beckoning, and but then this other side to him that was also being acknowledged through the cheating, through the lying, got the better of him. So thank you for listening. I hope you're gonna join me on this journey through just the puzzle pieces of the psychology, and just really going through the dimensions of this whole psychology of separation. Why it's interesting is because it applies to everybody. In a weird way, all of us are separated from everybody else. If you're alive, if you're a living person, you are an independent organism. You've got independent thoughts, you've got an independent identity, you've got a name, you've got an independent fate. Someone next to you may die of old age or a disease or whatever, and you live on. You're separated from them. When you die from whatever cause, then you will separate as well. And this is a crisis for the human animal, the fact that we are separated from one another. Culture and society and sex and love give us the illusion that we are part of something, but the psychology of separation persists, and the question is, how do you deal with it? How do you become part of something when you aren't? So thanks for listening. Look out for Murder Most Foul. It should be available on Amazon within a couple of hours, again, thanks very much to all the patrons that are here, and I will see you next time.